Hello everyone, welcome back. Today's episode is on a major blind spot for Kibby and me, so we're really excited to have our guest expert here. The episode is on autism, and although this is a blind spot for us, it's something that's also really interesting to us because of our focus on interpersonal effectiveness and dynamics. I think that this is a condition that isn't very well understood and is experienced by a large portion of the population. And so it's really kind of important to spread awareness and to find out how we can help our loved ones who may be a little different from us. So our guest expert today is Dr. Catherine Jones. She is a research psychology and director of the Wales Autism Research Center at Cardiff University. That is in Wales in the UK. It's funny, I'm from West Virginia, and so I would always have to tell people exactly where that was and that it was different from Virginia. So it was funny, Catherine, when you're like, do I need to make sure people know where that is? So welcome, Catherine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So if you could just tell us a little bit about how you would define autism. What are the qualifications for a diagnosis?
Okay, so autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So it's present in childhood, and neuro obviously relates to the brain functioning. And there are two key areas of difference that an autistic person has that someone without autism wouldn't have. And the first is around differences or difficulties around social communication. And the second is around differences with restricted and repetitive behaviors. So that's the very simple summary. There's loads within that to unpick, but in a nutshell, it's social communication differences and then the presence of restricted and repetitive behaviors.
And what can that look like? Like just to kind of illustrate a common case, because there's it's a spectrum, right? We hear autism spectrum disorders, and they could be so different on the different ends of it. So how do we know, is it the same disorder? What does it typically look like?
So, yeah, I think it's key. The word spectrum is really important. And the one phrase that many autism researchers, autistic people know of is, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Mm-hmm. It's really diverse. But all people with a diagnosis will share certain characteristics in common. So if we look at the social communication area, we've got three different domains within that. And one is about social emotional reciprocity. So how you interact back and forth with another person, how you share your social world. So an autistic person may do less of offering information about themselves. They might not share information about themselves. They may have difficulties with to and fro conversations. So a typical example is to say, if I said to somebody, oh, what's the weather like? Or how did you get here? An autistic person might manage with quite that kind of question because it's really concrete. But if I went, oh, I had a really crazy weekend, that would be much more difficult to cope with because it's really nuanced that I'm actually prompting you to ask me about my weekend. It's not clear at all. So it's picking up on those more complex social cues in terms of how we interact with one another and the extent to which we'll approach other people as well. So that's one way. And the other way I think people know quite a bit about is around nonverbal behaviors. So a lot of people, even in the lay population, will say, oh, something around eye contact. So eye contact can be different, but it can also be typical. And this is where the complexities come. So not every autistic person shows every single autistic trait. So it's just really being mindful of that and aware of those differences. But definitely nonverbal behaviors can be different. Gestures is the big one. So when I started in my autism research career, I learned how to do something called an ADOS, which is an autism assessment. It helps in diagnosis and it's used for research purposes. And we had to see how many gestures an autistic person makes in that session. And sometimes, you'd be lucky if you saw 2. But if you look at how much we gesture in real life, it's off the scale. People gesture all the time and they just don't realize they're doing it. And I always say in teaching to students, go and look in a coffee shop and see what people do when they talk to one another. Their hands will be flying everywhere. And then consider that with some autistic people, you just won't see any or hardly any at all. obviously there'll be autistic people who do gesture, but for me that was a really interesting part of my journey to understanding that those differences in autism.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And how those differences then could cause difficulties when you try and interact with other people. Like, you're not following up on conversations in a typical way. You might not have developed language. Your language may be just echoing what other people are saying and not seeming to have meaning in a typical sense. So the third area of difficulty then under social communication is challenges with relationships, forming relationships with other people. And that I think covers quite nicely another thing that often lay people think, well, autistic people don't want relationships and they're not interested. And there are definitely autistic people who do fit that criteria, is part of the criteria, but it's not true for everyone. And you'll see a lot of autistic people who are really impacted by the fact that they find relationships difficult, whether they be friendships or romantic relationships, relationships with colleagues. And those sorts of challenges can really impact on their quality of life and mental health. So I think that's also really important to be aware of when thinking about the spectrum and its diversity. So that kind of covers the social communication area. And the other area then is restricted and repetitive behaviors or interests, which I don't know, like, people who are not as familiar with autism, was that something that you were as aware of? Or
I'm going to be honest and say that I part of me has like an ulterior motive for talking about any autism researcher, which is that my husband thinks that he might be autistic. And so not my husband, my fiance, he, I don't know. So I'm always kind of like looking like, does that make sense to him? And I mean, one thing that he does is he has pretty fanatical interests. He's a painter and he paints every single night. It's like what he wants to do. He never loses interest. And it's amazing because now he's a fabulous painter and he's like gotten leagues better in the past 2 years. But he'll notice that he'll have, these sort of obsessions that come up. And then I know about like sort of stimming, I guess. So like kind of more tick-like behavior, I suppose.
So stimming would be like, we think of it as a repetitive motor behavior. So you're rapidly repeating a particular movement, and often that can, or the idea, there's some evidence that can cause have a self-regulatory function, like in soothing somebody and calming them down. So it can be really important. It brings in interesting issues when then you want to try and stop somebody doing something that's actually very helpful for them. But you're right, it's that the obsessive interest, and it could be like your fiance. So I'm not saying your fiance is autistic, by the way, but it could be an interest that feels very typical, like painting, or it could be an interest that's very unusual. So I've known of somebody who would collect photographs of telegraph poles. That's outside the realm of a typical interest. Or collecting insects to hold in little petri dishes, again, outside of the realm of a typical interest. But on the other hand, you've got a kid who's just really into dinosaurs, but doesn't stop talking about them. So it's just really interesting, that spectrum. And I think another area that's only, within the last, do my maths. Yeah, within the last 10 years has come into the diagnosis, which is around sensory differences, which people haven't considered. And we were talking before the recording started about misophonia, like you were saying about not liking the sound of people eating. But so people with autism can be hypersensitive to sounds or other sensory input, or not be sensitive enough, or want to seek out certain sensations that give them a lot of pleasure and interest. And I think the sensory element, we're becoming more and more aware how impairing and challenging that can be for autistic people to manage. So, if I want to deliver a lecture I'm doing it online at the moment, but in my office, I'm having a tutorial, but the lights make an autistic person feel really nauseous. I'm immediately making it not accessible to that autistic person, even though it seems like quite an innocuous thing that other people wouldn't be bothered by. Or for example, I have my office door open and there's a really noisy lift outside, and I know that has bothered autistic people in the past, whereas other people will filter that sound out and they just stop noticing it. So it's being aware of those sensory challenges. But I'm trying to think what we've missed. I think the other thing is around that rigidity of insisting on things being the same, needing things to be the same. So finding it difficult if something is suddenly like a child has the same route to school and then suddenly the mum or dad has to change it, and how they manage with that, needing to eat things in a certain order, just liking routine and liking things to always be the same. So there's about 4 categories of restricted and repetitive behaviour. An autistic person needs to show 2 of them to get a diagnosis. So again, immediately we're talking about diversity. So you could have a diagnosis and not really show any sensory difficulties of note, for example, but for another person, that could be the most challenging aspect of their autism diagnosis.
That's really helpful to know how it's diagnosed, because without having training in how to diagnose autism ourselves, we've done diagnostic interviews with people with personality disorders or like OCD, things that kind of could look like those symptoms. Like someone with obsessive compulsive personality disorder might have like that rigidity, might have the problems with people, right? And so, just like a different way of like thinking and interacting in social settings. So sometimes I'm always like, I can't tell if this person has like a personality disorder or OCD or autism.
Yeah, I think it becomes very complex for people who are at the end of autism, where they're much more, their communication skills are much higher and things like that. That it can get to differentially diagnose somebody. And sometimes there's co-occurrence. So you could have OCD and autism at the same time.
I see.
And the skill that's needed to tease those things apart. But yeah, we use an observation measure, or best practice in the UK certainly is an observation measure where you can put in place certain circumstances or situations to kind of test that person a little bit. You're not causing distress, but you might, for example, see a child play with you and see whether they use imaginative play, see if they want to play on their own terms and won't let you sort of take charge. You might see if they will ask you anything about yourself or whether they'll offer any information about yourself. So having those opportunities for that interaction, and with adults is a lot more questioning to understand their understanding of concepts and things like that. And then also there's often a diagnostic interview, which can be, or typically it's with a caregiver, because it's about understanding how a person is in their very young, at a young age. So those, because it's neurodevelopmental, those behaviors have to be there at a young age, or it wouldn't be autism, it would be something different. So with adults, often that isn't possible. A caregiver may not be available or really be able to reliably inform. So you do obviously interviews with the person themselves if they're an adult, but with children, then you'll be interviewing the caregiver. So yeah, best practice, you interview the caregiver and you observe the child in a particular setting. But that's not possible in every case. And for, different services have different things on offer, but yeah.
Do you know anything about the relationship between autism and creativity? Because I noticed, you were talking earlier about, not picking up on nuance very much, at least in social situations. But I didn't know if that extended, because I think of creativity as a fairly nuanced project, like, creative writing or painting. It's not exactly straightforward or objective. And that's one thing, I guess, that's interesting me, is that Paul's a painter and yet thinks he's autistic. And so I didn't know. And then you just said you were just talking about imaginative play. So do kids with autism play differently? Are they likely to be creative? What's the relationship there?
Yeah, so there's always been this idea about imaginative play being different, or finding that more difficult, like it being more embedded in reality. So to say, if you were looking with a child, that they would use, let's say they didn't have a little toy figure to represent a man, so they might pretend like a pen is a man. An autistic child would be less likely to do that, or less able to do that. But a lot of autistic people would say, yeah, I do have imagination, I do have creativity. It just might be different to the sort of neurotypical majority. And we kind of put a value judgment on what creativity is or what it should look like. So yes, autistic people can be creative, and that might be informed by the way that they see the world that is different to the majority. But so yeah, autistic people can show creativity, but it may look different.
And how young can we detect autism? Are you talking about doing interviews or interviewing caregivers and watching their play? Are there any like genetic testing, or how young can you really determine, like if you have a baby or even prenatal, are there any tests for that, or is it?
No, so it's defined by the behaviors. And as you can tell from some of those behaviors, they're not behaviors you'd be expecting a very, very young child. So how they're coping with conversations and so on. So you've got to be at a particular age already. In terms of the diagnostic criteria, so that's around 3. I mean, it's unusual to go much lower than that, but I should say I'm not in the cutting edge of diagnosis. But there's definitely no genetic tests. We can see that autism runs in families, but the genetics are incredibly complex. There's not a single gene for autism. We're talking about multiple genes for different behaviors. And I guess I've inferred it already, but the key is with autism, it's about, do you see that pattern of behaviors? And that pattern is really complex and can be different in different individuals. And that some of those difficulties can be quite subtle as well, so kind of hard to unpick. As I say, you might only really understand an autistic person's social difficulties if you put them into a group situation that's maybe very social and free-flowing, in a situation that you see them in a class with you where there's an instructor asking questions. They may look totally indistinguishable. So it's about nuance, context as well. I may have gone off on a tangent then.
No, it's fascinating.
Yeah. So, I mean, what is it? Can you give a sense of what it might be like to parent a child with autism?
I feel I should say no, in the sense that I'm not a parent and certainly not a parent of a child with autism. So I guess I can talk from my experience of reading other people's accounts or knowing about research. And I think it varies for people. They're often, I did quite a lot. One of my studies, we did a lot of work talking with parents of adolescents, and it was interesting to see them reflect on the journey that they went through. There's a lot of people can feel grief, and sort of adjustment to a new reality. And then by adolescence, even though I guess at adolescence you're talking about a whole new set of challenges, whether somebody's autistic or not, that they moved on a lot in that journey, and that was interesting to see.
Or like, are there any particular challenges that parents have kind of repeatedly mentioned?
Yeah, so you've got, if you think about the criteria, the insistence on sameness and the need for routine can be really challenging for families. And I've heard people finding their social lives really reduced down because they know their child will find it so difficult if they do something out of the ordinary, and the fallout will be so significant. It's not fair on the child, and it's not fair on the family either, or on perhaps other siblings. Again, kids who are very sensory, so the mum wants to nip to the supermarket, but that environment with the bright lights, the noise, the unpredictability could be totally overwhelming for their child. So that again can restrict them. And part of that, of course, you have to factor in its judgment from other people, kind of perhaps not understanding what's going on, or the parent implicitly feeling judged. So I think that's where it becomes a broad issue about society and how we accept difference, and maybe the measures that we put in place to help accommodate difference. But definitely the rigidity can be very challenging.
That's just such a visceral image, I mean, you're taking your kid to the grocery store. It's not their fault. They're completely overwhelmed and overstimulated. Then they start screaming. Then strangers start looking. I mean, I can see immediately why you would just want to stop going. All they see is a screaming child. They have no idea what caused it and what's going on.
And I remember in one of the hospitals I was working at, the case I heard of that was very severe was this mother who had a kind of a full-grown son, but very low-functioning autism, and she had to do a routine every single day to the T. Like, she had to sing a certain song, she had to, like, bring food at a certain time and this kind of food, and if anything deviated from that routine, he would get violent, and he would do repetitive hitting motions. So, I mean, I can't even imagine, just the life, of the whole family, coping with that together.
I think it can be really challenging. I think it's also worth putting the flip on that as well and saying that obviously autistic children, like any children, bring a huge amount of joy, and that there's a lot, that there's a lot that an autistic child can bring to a family's life to enrich it as well. And their way of seeing the world, it can be so different. But it's about embracing that, seeing what that person has to teach you, as well as, you teach as a parent. I've worked with, so the part of the reason I was involved in autism was my mum taught autistic children. So I did some placements as a student, and, autistic children are like fantastic. That sort of what you might call a quirkiness, the way of interacting with you, the way of like that showing affection, or that it's not typical, their own ways of communicating. Like it was, a really fantastic experience. So there are definitely challenges, but there are definitely, as I say, I'm not speaking as a parent myself, but from what I know, there are also many rewards as well.
Can you give us an example of a nice way that they've expressed their emotions or care or anything else that you feel like
there's one boy I don't know, it's about affection, but it was about, he would always say like the jewel of the Nile in a very particular intonation, which is really common, that kind of echoing, just very stereotyped speech. And it was just utterly delightful, and it would just make you smile. I guess if I'd heard that for the 900th time, I may have stopped smiling. But you just think, that's brilliant. That's you're getting pleasure from just repeating a sentence. I wish I could get that kind of pleasure just from repeating a sentence. How glorious. You just do see things a bit differently. So when you're with children like that, that there's a certain simplicity in things,
I suppose if there is an obsessional interest too, I mean, there's a lot to learn from that.
Yeah,
you learn everything there is to learn about dinosaurs.
yeah, exactly, and where it can take you, and I guess you're a child's extraordinary mind. My goodness, that kids will remember all sorts, and not every autistic child or person has an exceptional memory, but because it's an interest, if you're very interested with something and you spend a lot of time with it, you're likely to know a lot of facts.
So you're already talking about it implicitly, thinking of strategies or things that parents or other family members can know, or ways to manage the symptoms. I mean, one thing you're saying is to enjoy what they bring, the unique perspective and the unique way of seeing and interacting with the world. Is there anything else that you think is important for families or parents to know, especially if they're struggling with the experience, or kind of at wit's end? I mean, I'm mostly thinking about actually that the parent who I just talked about, she was really like, I don't know what to do. I'm alone in this. I don't know what autism is. I basically know to not interrupt his routines, otherwise he's gonna go nuts. Like, what do I do? So just like any kind of like words of advice or perspectives that parents or family members can kind of take in.
Yeah, I think and that parent that you're describing, it sounds like they're in a really difficult place and that they need support and guidance, and to be in a situation where you're not even quite sure about the profile of autism and what that is, and that's not good. I think it's difficult to give generic advice in the sense that every person is different, and I think it's about knowing that individual and knowing what their particular needs are, and where structure is important, and where you can loosen it a bit, and just getting to know that individual. It's really difficult to sort of give generic blanket advice, and I think that would be really, I can imagine a lot of autistic people would react against that, because they'd be like, well, that isn't me, or families, but that isn't my child. But I think it's about speaking to it depends on their level of the child's level of communication, but it's understanding trying to get inside that child's mind to understand where they're coming from and why they're doing or behaving in a certain way. So an anecdote that I can think of off the top of my head is where there was a person with autism who had particularly significant communication needs and challenging behaviors. So they were, I think they might have been a young adult, but they were in a sort of supported accommodation, and a clinical psychologist was brought in because this person's behavior had got, they just couldn't manage it. And what they were doing was stealing the water from all the other residents, causing all sorts of problems. So stealing their drinks, taking their drinks, couldn't get to the bottom of it. And when the psychologist came in, she realized it was as simple as that their medication had changed, and then medication was making them incredibly thirsty. And you think, crikey, that's so simple as a solution. But actually, this person was being demonized for this bad behavior. And when you have very limited communication, sometimes the only communication you manage is communication that's about meeting your own needs. And that's what that person was doing. And they actually were, in a sense, indirectly saying, I'm thirsty, I need a drink, but didn't have the tools to do that. And it had to be picked up by somebody with skill. So it is very much about trying to understand the situation and working where you can with people with, expertise to support you. And anecdotally, I hear that parents can get a lot of support from other parents, or autistic adults get a lot of support from other autistic adults who understand they've walked in their shoes. And a lot of the journey, I think, of parenting is about is emotional as much as anything else. The mental health, not feeling alone, feeling understood. So I think it's about reaching out and trying to, I think a lot of families do end up isolated. We talked about, you're not able to go out in a spontaneous way. So a group of friends might be doing something, but you can't join in because you didn't know about it 3 weeks ago. You haven't been able to prepare your child for it. So it's about, having people around you as much as possible. But again, I feel like I'm talking, it's very hard then not to see in my mind's eye a specific case or specific scenario that just might not be relevant to other people. It really might not. And I think that's what we have to be really careful about, that every autistic person is different, just as every person without autism is different. So just to bear that in mind, really. For some people, the co-occurring mental health problems may be more of an issue to them than the actual autism themselves. So like their anxiety might be extremely bad, and that's to them what's the most, that's what they feel the biggest difficulty is for them, is managing that.
Is that a big comorbidity? Autism?
Yeah, so anxiety is highly co-occurring with autism. You're far more likely to have anxiety issues if you're autistic. And there's been some research recently suggesting that you can have kind of generic anxiety that the rest of us may experience, but then some more autism specific types of anxiety. So, it's still being unpicked and understood. But yeah, anxiety definitely. And other types of co-occurrence. So we've been doing work on eating disorders. So often young women end up with a diagnosis of an eating disorder. And in our experience, the eating disorder always preceded the autism diagnosis. And and often these people who do come to a diagnosis late get diagnosed with other issues or other difficulties first. And it's really fascinating to try and work out why you get co-occurrence sometimes in these sorts of situations. And with eating disorders, you've got the issues around rigidity. So you can imagine with anorexia, it's a lot of rigidity around food. And with autistic people, you've got an issue with rigidity. So is it just a case, therefore, that food becomes the area of rigidity? But some of the people we've spoken to, it's just so fascinating. You get somebody saying, well, I want to be a certain number on the scales because I like it to be a particular number. It's not because I want to be really thin. It's because I just need it to be a particular number. Or, somebody saying, I don't want to eat that food because of the sensory experience of it. I don't like the texture, not because it's calorific. So it's kind of really understanding sometimes why these other co-occurring disorders appear and whether the autism is intrinsically tied up in it or not, as the case may be. So that's a whole other area that autistic people have to contend with, is how their autism may interact with mental health difficulties and maybe compound it, or maybe cause a problem then for trying to treat a mental health difficulty and really support that person appropriately, because using an off-the-shelf treatment for a non-autistic person just might not fit them. So it can be really challenging for people who end up with a co-occurring difficulty.
And I see that the symptoms can look the same, of rigidity around food, not wanting to eat, but with people with anorexia, they might be more worried about the body image and the weight, whereas autistic people will have different reasons why they're doing it. So I just love your general strategy of just learning about your child or learning about the person with autism. I mean, that there's no blanket, this is how you deal with their repetitive movements, or this is how you deal with this. It's like, get to know that person, communicate with them, figure out their needs and how they're communicating those with you.
Yeah, and I think another thing that's important to say is that, to find out what a person thinks about being autistic, because it varies. And, a lot of people, if young people are listening to this, they may know an autistic person who might have a very strong sense of their autistic identity and not think of it as a problem, They might think it causes them some challenges, but they're very happy being autistic, and they think that society doesn't make enough, it doesn't adapt sufficiently for their needs, and they'd be making a very good point. So I think that there's been some really interesting work now looking at this idea of double empathy, that people have been researching and trying to understand autism from the perspective of non-autistic people, and making a huge value judgment on that somehow that to be non-autistic is to be better, because this is a sort of normal, quote unquote. But actually what the research has found is that non-autistic people aren't necessarily very good at understanding autistic people, but we've spent all our energy focusing on the fact that autistic people don't understand non-autistic people and not looking in the other direction. So non-autistic people aren't always great at understanding facial expressions or the intentions of autistic people. But we tend not to judge ourselves for that. Whereas we judge autistic people for getting it, quote unquote, wrong. So there's some really interesting research now coming out around that, around neurodiversity and about accepting difference, and maybe not putting those value judgments on behaviors, and thinking of us all being on a spectrum of diversity where difference should be tolerated, not just tolerated, but accepted and allowed to thrive. And we impose our values on people where it just might not be relevant. So autistic people said, look, for years you measure our quality of life, but using indicators of quality of life that don't really necessarily mean that much to us, or don't really capture what we think of as a valued life, an important life. And it's been very humbling. So there's in terms of research, there's now a big movement to include autistic people in the research process far more. Which I think is really important, because if you ask any autism researcher, why are you doing this? I'd be shocked if they didn't say to create better and more meaningful lives for autistic people. And, if you want to do that, at face value, it seems a bit ridiculous that you don't then include autistic people in the decisions you make around the research that you do. Because if you're wanting to help autistic people live better lives, you need to know from them what they think is important and whether you're going about it in the right way. So it's a really exciting time, I think, for autism research at the moment, to face that challenge of being more inclusive in our research practices, to allow autistic people to have that voice and have that space more, so that we can do better research, really.
That is really cool.
Yeah.
And also kind of funny how people wouldn't necessarily think to do that, even though when you say it, it's totally obvious.
Yeah.
So I know you don't do treatment, and also I loved your comment before we started this, that it's not so much treatment because you're not trying to cure autism. We are in the business of, I suppose, curing a lot more. And so, for instance, when people have a rigid behavior, or, something that they're avoiding, we might make them approach, we might do exposures. And does that be very different for somebody with autism, where you're not trying to cure them, you're trying to, what is the goal there, I guess?
So I think the key difference is if you're working with a mental health problem, then somebody is presenting with something that is causing them distress that they don't want in their lives. Now, a special interest is not something an autistic person doesn't want. Typically, it's their interest, they love it. Other people might find it difficult because I think it's impeding their learning. They keep talking about trains, and I want to teach them about this today. But for that person, it's not a problem. And they need their enjoyment of routines and rigidity. Again, it's how much that is a problem for that person, which is, I think, very different with OCD, when you've got this sort of compulsions and people not wanting to be a certain way and trying to manage that. Whereas with autism, a lot of the time, the problems come in because people require them to be more flexible than they're happy with. But if if they were in an environment, like, so often kids can work perfectly well in a very structured, timetabled environment, and then not work very well when you put them in a different environment. So kind of the environment becomes part of their challenge. So it's like that social model of disability. It's not saying that there's biologically differences in autistic people, but also the environment and the social constructions can perhaps exacerbate and make things more difficult for them. Rather than something like anxiety or depression, where that person is carrying around a weight that they really don't want. So that's why we come at it at a totally different perspective. And it's about supporting that person in sort of living, the best life that they can. And I think I also always pause when I say this, because, again, I want to come back to the fact that the spectrum is so broad. So that might work incredibly well for a university student who's got some social challenges and finds that people around them don't kind of accept their quirkiness or don't like them talking about their special interests. But that might feel a bit hollow to a parent, like you discussed earlier, who's kind of like, my child is in these routines and I can't do anything. My life is feeling really reduced and I'm feeling really stressed. So again, the needs of the autistic community are really broad. And we need to acknowledge that. And for some people, they do want more change, they do want more support, they do need things to be better in a far more fundamental way than other people. So I think we just need to be careful about it. But I do think it's important to reflect ourselves as non-autistic people around, well, what actually is going on here? Why is this a problem? Like the fact that I've just said to somebody, oh, yeah, I had a really nice weekend, and they've not responded. That's just their different communication style. It's not them being rude. It's not wrong. It's not different. I've just in a position where I value my own social style better because it's mine and because it's what the majority do. And I think if you can all be a bit more reflective and be curious about other people's differences, rather than, I guess, our own neurotypical rigidity about, well, this is the norm, this is how it should be, you should be adjusting to us, or don't you have problems because you can't be like me, and just kind of celebrate and embrace that difference and that diversity and the kind of different sort of, we talk about creativity, the different sort of creativities that can bring, the different perspectives that can bring. I think we'd be better for it.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. I mean, this is making me think so differently about, how do you treat or, intervene or change social difficulties, for example. I mean, even just and I love the perspective of taking their perspective, right? And just saying, well, maybe we want to treat them because, it's an impulse to try to make someone like us. Versus, the major breakthrough in borderline personality disorder treatment and research was that a famous researcher, Marsha Linehan, who has borderline personality disorder herself, was like, all the treatments now are not really getting it. Let me make my own. And that, was hugely successful. So I love that new perspective of not trying to change someone and make them more like us, more quote unquote normal, but how can we understand and celebrate the differences?
Yeah, because an autistic person could quite rightly say, well, how ridiculous to say to me, oh, I had a really great weekend, and then expect me to know that you want me to ask how your weekend was. And I think, yeah, good point. That why isn't my problem? I'm not being clear. You know? It's so yeah. I think there's I just think neurodiversity is great. We have lots to learn from each other and different perspectives, and being open-minded and yeah, accommodating difference. And we talk about people talk a lot about autism-friendly environments, like creating spaces that autistic people can feel more comfortable. But a lot of the time I think, well, that's just friendly spaces. Like everyone would benefit from nicer lighting that isn't as harsh, or from not having sounds going off all over the place, or from having a really clear agenda so people know what's going to go on in the meeting, that the meeting does finish when we think it's going to finish. You know, these are things that make it nicer for everyone. So yeah, I think we've got lots to learn. Yeah, and one of the things that often happens now in research context is that we can use ways of supporting, enabling autistic people to communicate how they would like to communicate with us. Often it's called like a traffic light system, like people who are green, kind of, you can approach that person, they're happy to have questions asked of them. Then maybe amber is like, I can be asked a direct question, but please don't expect me to approach you. And then red can be, please don't approach me. And these sort of adjustments can be really helpful in terms of managing certain situations and making everybody feel more comfortable, because I think then the neurotypical people feel more comfortable because they're not in a situation then that they're making someone feel uncomfortable either. And another thing that often happens is instead of clapping, because the noise of a clap can be quite aversive. Often we do hand waving, so you wave your hands, which has become quite common, and which again, it just makes it bearable, to be quite frank, for some people who are highly sensitive to the sound of lots of the noise of clapping. So there are lots of sort of adjustments that we can make to that I think help everybody ultimately.
I'd love to hear more about any other projects or things that you're excited about and working on now. And I read that you did a film about autism. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
Yeah, so that was that came from the Welsh government, who wanted to create it's a national autism team under the Welsh government. They wanted to create a film that would help support frontline professionals in better understanding about autism. So we created a film called The Birthday Party, which is about 3 autistic children attending a birthday party. And through that journey of their attendance, we get to see 3 different types of children with very different presentations of autism. So we hope we're making the point that autism looks different in different children, and that sometimes those autistic differences can be quite subtle. And it's about the pattern of behavior. If you've got poor eye contact, that doesn't make you autistic. It's a complex pattern of behaviors, and it's been really rewarding. So we're absolutely thrilled by the reaction from other countries. So I think I'm going to get the number wrong, but I think it's been translated into maybe 6 or 7 languages now.
Wow.
And countries approaching us. And humbling as well, because we think, like in the UK, we need to do more. We need to get people, frontline professionals, general practitioners, to recognise autism when it appears. But you look in other countries where they're so much further behind in terms of not having the structures in place to support autistic children, the stigma that of parents and autistic people having to deal with autism diagnosis. So yeah, it's been really fantastic, and to work with people in other countries about getting the word out. I mean, it's freely available as well. So lots of people contact us just asking to use it in training, and they're not all frontline professionals. It's a real variety of people. So yeah, no, that's been a really fun project actually, and one where you can have direct impact. It goes directly, that product, and it's based, I should say, actually importantly, it's based on research evidence. So we didn't just come up with this, we covered this, what we call the signs of autism. Those signs came from research. It wasn't something we just sort of came up with on the back of an envelope. And I think that's been a big challenge for certainly in autism, but I imagine it's in all sorts of areas where there isn't the evidence base for training or for interventions. People just go for it, and people are so desperate for stuff that it just gets rolled out. And I think it's important to pause, take breath, and do things properly, even if it means that things take longer to come to fruition. Yeah, definitely.
That's great. How can people access it, or how can people watch it? We could put it on our website if there's a link, or if there's any place to direct people.
Yeah, so I think this just put me on the spot. I think if you type autismchildsigns.com into your browser, it should take you straight there. The actual link's a bit more complicated. It's on the Welsh Local Government Association website, but it's free. And we sort of ask if you wanted to use it in training. It's very helpful if you could fill in just a one-page document, a form, and send it to me. So then we've got a record. But we hope more and more people find it useful.
Awesome. And are there any other resources you would recommend? Any books or websites?
Yeah, this is where I find it really challenging to make recommendations. I think because it really depends on the individual and their needs and where they sit. If you're an autistic adult who is waiting for a diagnosis, you're not even sure if you're on the spectrum, versus you're a parent of a 4-year-old with really significant needs. I mean, it's just totally different. I know in the UK there are always great local organisations. People really do come together. So I'd always recommend people look sort of locally to see what's out there. I think, to be honest, I think if you're an autistic person wanting to know about autism, I don't know whether I've got anything to say that they already know, or family members. I mean, which is, the national organisations. But, it is helpful for people to look locally, I think, and to reach out, because the other people who've been through it are, ultimately going to be the people who are going to be most helpful, I would have thought.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, we'll put any kind of local resources on the website so listeners can go to our page and check that out.
Great. Well, Dr. Jones, it's been wonderful having you on. Also should mention to our listeners that you are our wonderful producer, Carly's advisor at University of Cardiff.
I am. Yeah, we're really thrilled to have Carly here. She's my first real American PhD students. That's very exciting. I know she's been fantastic. So we're really enjoying having her with us. She's a great addition to the team.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much again. And I've learned so much today. I'm really, really grateful to have learned some about this, because it's just been such a clear absence in my kind of body of knowledge. So thanks so much for coming on.
Not at all, my pleasure.
And we hope that you will rate, review, and subscribe, and join us again next week. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only, and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.